All right, back to the 1689 Confession. We have completed our examination of the second chapter. You remember we were looking at the second chapter of God and the Holy Trinity, and we looked just at the three paragraphs there, and then we took a parenthesis to go and examine the Confession of Grace Fellowship because we have a much more detailed confession than what is written here. And so we spent some time through that, but now it's back to the 1689 and we come to chapter 3. This chapter is entitled Of God's Decree. And I said to somebody earlier today that this is the chapter that separates the men from the boys. All right? If there's any doubt about the reformed nature of the Baptists in the 17th century in London, this chapter will diffuse those doubts. Okay? The confession was originally written, as you recall from our original discussion, to describe how the various groups of Reformed Christians in England, the Presbyterians followed by the Congregationalists followed by the Baptists, how they all understood the various elements of the gospel, the various message of the message of the church. The confession doesn't deal with every detail of Christian theology, of course. It would be as thick as a systematic theology if it did, but it's designed to focus itself in on the kinds of things that would be essential for understanding what makes a Baptist, or what makes a Presbyterian, etc. Okay, so in other words, it's designed to say, here is what we as a group of believers take from the Scriptures as the basic confession that we want to make sure the rest of the world understands. And chapter 3, in my opinion, sets the stage for the very real difference between a Reformed / Calvinistic / Augustinian / Pauline version of the gospel versus so many other kinds that are out there. Okay, I will lump all of them into synergism. I'll call them synergistic because they all are, in one way or another. They're centered around man. They're centered around men and what men do and how men think and how men decide their own destinies. Okay? This chapter is going to make it clear that our Baptist forebears did not think that way. Their understanding of Scripture, their understanding of the doctrine of God, which is the first two chapters, led them to a strong conclusion that was essential for understanding everything that would come from that point. That's what chapter 3 is going to do. Because look, I think the vast majority of synergists would agree with most everything written in the first chapter on Scripture and even the second chapter on God. Yeah, there'd be a few areas of disagreement on the nature of God or the nature of Scripture in a general size sense. But I think if you sat a typical synergist down and read them those, they'd go, yeah, okay, I agree with all that. But now when we get to chapter 3, okay, because this is the one that's going to make it clear what the real gospel hinges upon. Now, I have said to you before, and I apologize for repeating myself, but sometimes I do that. The topic we're going to talk about in chapter 3 was unknown to me in any sense of the word until I came to understand Reformed theology. You will not hear about this subject in the typical evangelical church in America. It simply isn't there. There isn't anything of this chapter in the vast majority of churches. And I think, personally, if I might just opine for a moment, I think that explains why the church in the West is as weak and worthless as it is. Okay. It long ago gave up a view of the gospel, a view of Scripture, a view of God, where God is central, and switched it to us being at the center of all things. Well, chapter 3 will dispel that notion pretty quickly. If you can say amen to what is written in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Seven paragraphs of this chapter. You can say amen to what's written in here. You are truly reformed. Okay? This is it. This is where it's going to come from, is right here. The rest is all going to flow out of here. This is a picture of what sets us apart from others. Now, it's going to flow into other chapters that follow, of course, like creation and divine providence and so forth. But you want to get to the heart of the matter. Here it is. This is a chapter on the decree of God, otherwise known as a description of the sovereignty of God. Here it is. So, we enter into this chapter with a little trepidation because it is going to be very, very profound, and it is, frankly, even though it's written in words on paper, it is extraordinarily difficult to describe. It's not an easy subject to grasp. And the reason why is obvious. It involves the nature of an infinite God. And the nature of an infinite God cannot be properly expressed in words, no matter how hard we might try. I mean, we've got 66 books attempting to do it. One short 7-paragraph chapter certainly ain't going to do it. Okay. But these men wrote what I think is an extraordinary defense of the decree of God and His sovereignty. Okay, so here we go. You ready? And I say all of that so that you can dismiss yourself now if you don't want to go here. But here we go. All right. Chapter 3 of God's decree, paragraph 1. God hath decreed in Himself from all eternity by the most wise and holy counsel of His own will, freely and unchangeably, all things whatsoever comes to pass. Now that's a massive statement, but let's explain what it means. God hath decreed. A decree is issued by a king in which he makes a statement of something that is to be understood or carried out. A decree is an order from the throne, if you will. Okay, so when we talk about a decree, we're talking about God establishing by virtue of an edict of some sort, a decree, this is what is to be true. Now, for an ordinary earthly king, of course, it's a decree having to do with some aspect of kingdom life. But this decree is a decree coming out of an infinite God who has decreed something to be the case. Now, just stop right there and have you notice that. There is a divine decree. There is a divine decree. God has decreed. He has spoken. And this has nothing to do with creation, in a sense. It is beyond creation. It is a decree in which God Himself has issued a statement from Himself, and the audience of this decree is Himself. Okay, you got that? The audience of this decree is not us. The audience decree is Him. He has specified what He has ordered to happen to Himself. You might say it's an intra-Trinitarian, easy for you to say, statement. It is the Father saying to the Son, and the Father saying to the Spirit, and the Son saying to the Spirit, and then so forth. This is what we have decreed. Now, we very often attribute this to the Father. You'll notice the confession just uses the word God in a general sense here. It's typically understood that it's the Father who makes such a decree. And again, that flows out of the Trinitarian idea that the Father is the one that establishes all things. Okay, so it wouldn't be wrong to say that the Father's decree, but it's important to understand that the decree isn't just coming from the Father. It's coming from the Son and from the Spirit. The three persons who all bear the fullest nature of God in themselves are all a part of the decree. So just as the Father decrees, the Son has decreed as well. So the Jesus that was walking around in Galilee had, in eternity past, decreed all that would be happening to Him in the life that he was leading, and so on, okay, to the infinite. So God has decreed, and it is this decree that establishes all things, okay? Everything. How much? Everything that comes to pass. Everything that is. God has decreed. And he's decreed in himself. I think what the point of those two words is that this is an edict, a decree from God that is not based on anything outside of himself. God has not decreed because he has seen something and responded to it in some way. This is a decree within God. God has decreed within himself. He has purposed within himself. There's another way that we might say that. And it says he's done that from all eternity. That word from all eternity means that it is a part of the eternal nature of God. It is not something in time and space. It's not in the created order. It is something that exists outside of time and space. It is something that exists within the nature of God himself. I think you could make a pretty good argument theologically that the decree of God is a part of the very nature of God himself, yet at the same time is distinct from the nature of God from our vantage point, because we have to do that as humans. We have to differentiate this from that, right? But the decree is a part of the very nature of God. It's in himself, and it's a part of what he is in eternity, outside of the bounds of time and space. So it's a decree in which God has said, that God has ordered, or whatever synonym you want to use for that, in which he has made a decree. He has decreed something to be the case. And he's done so by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will. Where did this decree come from? From his own will, his own desire, his own choice. The word will is another word for volition. From his own volition, it's of his own choice. He has chosen of his own wisdom, his infinite understanding of all things, including himself, that he decrees from his own wise and holy counsel. And that word holy, by the way, indicates that this decree is based on God's holiness, his absolute purity, his absolute moral perfections, his absoluteness, all right? This decree has come from all of those things. Again, you'll notice I'm trying to paint a word picture here of something that is almost impossible to paint in words. How do you describe this thing? It is God's orders from within himself, from himself, as himself. It's hard to put all that into words. But he has decreed in himself from all eternity, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably. Now those two words are key. He has freely chosen, and he has unchangeably chosen, meaning his decree is something that he himself feels free about. He is not binding him in any way. He has decreed this because this is what he wills. He's not bound by anything outside of himself, and so it is what he has purposed to accomplish, and it is unchangeable. It cannot be changed. It cannot be changed by anything inside of God nor outside of God. Now, inside of God, there would be no reason for it to change, right? But it's also not changeable by anything outside of God. So God in eternity past, okay, I have to speak anthropomorphically for a moment. In eternity past, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit, the one God, Yahweh, decreed, okay, here's what I want to happen. And I have chosen that of my own free will, and it will not be changeable. It is. It simply is. Just as God said to Moses, I am that I am, the decree of God is because it is. Same way. Same idea. It exists within the very nature of God himself. It is of his own free will. It is of his own devices, his own purposes, and he has made it out of his own free choices and unchangeably. And what his decree has decreed everything that happens. I'm letting that sink in for a moment. Everything that happens. Brian just nodded his head a moment ago. God ordained that in his decree. Cleveland is wearing a blue shirt. God decreed that blue shirt to be on his back. Everything. I think I described it some time ago in a sermon. God has decreed every single hydrogen atom that fuses with another hydrogen atom in the surface of the sun to produce a helium atom and release heat and energy. Every single one. Across not only our little star, but a few septillion more. Beyond our comprehension. That every single thing that comes to pass in time and space and outside of time and space is ordained and set in decree by God. He has willed all that comes to pass. Nothing comes to pass except that which God has ordained to come to pass. That is the decree of God that he has freely chosen in an unchangeable way from inside his nature. Okay, who wants to leave now? What's the problem with that statement? That's too generic. The real problem with the statement is, you mean everything? You mean every single thing? You mean the number of hairs on my head and the places that I go and the things that I do and everything that happens and all the choices that I make and all the choices that everybody else makes across thousands of years of time, adding up to an unbelievable number of consequences? Everything? Everything. Whatsoever. All things whatsoever comes to pass. As I said, this is what separates the men from the boys right here, doesn't it? And this is not only a statement that's impossible really for us to grasp, but it's also deeply offensive. We hate it. As unregenerate men, now, those of us who've been born again by the Spirit of God, we love it, but those who have not been affected, they hate this decree. Why? Because it means that they are in control of nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because God has willed all that comes to pass. This is, that statement right there, that first statement before the semicolon in paragraph 1, destroys the religion of synergism. Flat out destroys it. There's nothing left of it. Nothing remains. It has been completely burned up. Because if this statement is true, then no amount of wishful thinking on our part as human beings means a thing in terms of the grand scheme of how this world works itself out. Now, lest you think I'm being a fatalist, okay, we will address the rest of the chapter, because the rest of the chapter goes through and says, okay, wait, hold it. Let's make sure we understand what we're talking about here, okay? But the statement starts and stands on its own. God has decreed all that comes to pass. And you will notice that the proof text that's chosen for this particular sentence is from Isaiah 46. And this is God speaking through Isaiah. He says, "Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things not yet done. Saying, this is God speaking about himself and what he said, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country, I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it. That's God speaking about himself. He's saying, listen, I have decided all that comes to pass. Everything that happens, I have decided, because I am God. I've declared the end from the beginning. I've said this is what it's going to turn out like, and this is where it's going to start, and I've decided everything in between to get you from that point to that point. And I've also declared from ancient times, which is probably a Hebrew way of saying before time itself, I have declared things that haven't yet been done. The Bible, and there's other proof texts we could choose from, many we could choose from, but it's clear that a high view of God starts with the view that God is utterly sovereign over all things. See, the word sovereign simply is a word to describe this. This is what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is the description of God as being the absolute and final ruler of all things that take place, period, end of sentence. God is sovereign in the sense that he is the one who has ordained all things to come to pass. Someone asked me earlier if I had heard of this idea that God is sovereign, but he's willing to allow some of his sovereignty to be given to others in order for them to have a freedom to act. This is a common synergistic argument, and I've heard it many times. Well, yeah, God is sovereign, but he gives up control of certain things. He turns over certain things so that we can have freedom to act and to will and to love and so forth. And it's a canard because it's basically saying, well, as Les has rightly pointed out many times, okay, he had a friend that once said, God is sovereign, up to a point. Well, that's not sovereign. That's not the very definition of sovereign is very much like the word perfect. Okay? There is no, a little bit of imperfect, right? It's either perfect or it's not. There's no middle ground. There's no in between those two things. Either God is sovereign, either he has absolutely decreed all that comes to pass, or he has not. He's absolutely sovereign over all things, or he's not. That's just the end of the discussion. I mean, even the synergist has to admit that in the end. He has to admit that the language demand, I realize language means nothing, but he has to demand, the language has to demand, that the word must have a meaning. The word means utterly in charge, in control, having purpose, all that comes to pass, having ordained all things that come to pass. And so, Reformed theology is built on this premise of the sovereignty of God. It's built at that as the starting point. Reformed theology starts from the perspective that man is not sovereign, God is. And if God is sovereign, then all things are determined by him. There are some who try to, there's someone said not too long ago, I think it was James White, said that the only truly consistent synergist is an open theist. An open theist says God doesn't actually know what's going to happen in the future. Okay? The open theist says God can't know what's going to happen. Okay? All right, let's use Cleveland's shirt as an example. All right? Cleveland stood before his closet and picked this particular shirt. Nice choice, by the way. Either that or his wife did. Someone picked it. Okay? Now, the open theist says in order for Cleveland to actually make a decision that's absolutely of his will, God cannot possibly know what he chose, because if God already knows yesterday what shirt Cleveland's going to wear, then there's no other possibility that Cleveland could wear a different shirt, because God already saw him wearing, already knew him, I should say, wearing the shirt he's wearing, right? So the open theist says, well, therefore God cannot know in order for us to have the ability to choose. But again, notice the problem. The problem is, okay, so God gives up his sovereignty. Well, guess what? It's not just shirt choices that have to be then given up by God. It has to be every single choice you make about every single thing. Now multiply that by a few 100 million decisions that you made today alone, and multiply that by 8 billion people on the planet, and you've got a whole lot of decisions that God has left to others. How much sovereignty is left? Well, nothing. That's the point. God knows because he has purposed it to be. God knows because he has purposed it to be. Unlike us, God's knowledge is not passive. Our knowledge is passive. We know because we observe. I see Colin's wearing a yellow shirt. Nice choice. So he's wearing this nice little yellow shirt. But I know that only because I've observed it. Did I know that when Colin got into his car at home and began driving here? Unless I was talking to him by FaceTime on his phone, I probably wouldn't have known that he was wearing a yellow shirt. I could have taken a guess, but I'd probably been wrong. So when we talk about passive knowledge, we're talking about God having knowledge of that. We're talking about humans having knowledge by virtue of taking in information. God's knowledge is not passive. God's knowledge is active. God knows because he ordained it to be so. He ordained before the foundation of the world that Colin should wear that particular shirt, Cleveland should wear that particular shirt. His knowledge is not because he observes, but because he purposes and ordains what comes to pass. See, that's why it's so hard to get a hold of the decree, because you and I, we don't live in that world. None of us have active knowledge. None of us have active knowledge. All of our knowledge is passive. We take in information and we know, but we know only because we observe. And so God's knowledge is very different from ours, which is why this whole decree issue is so difficult. It's hard to imagine. Wait. You're telling me that comes to pass because God purposes it, which means God knows it because he purposes it? That's exactly what I'm saying. He knows it because he purposed it to be the case. Well, I don't have any experience in that. You're right, you don't. You don't. But that is what this decree is about. God, in his sovereignty, has purposed all things that come to pass. Every single thing that happens in this world, God has said it will be. And not only will it be, it must be. There is no other possibility. It is the way things will work out. So look, if you don't like who's the current resident of the White House, take it up with God. That was his choice. Okay? It doesn't matter how many people cheated to get him there. All that matters is that he's there because God ordained it. Did I say that out loud? It sounded so much better in my head. Okay. The bottom line is everything that happens to us. Now, let me tell you this. This may be a doctrine that is almost impossible for us to truly get our minds around. I mean, we can understand it in the sense that, okay, I get it. We can't fully explain it scientifically. And yet, it is the most comforting doctrine you can learn, in my opinion. Why is always the question, isn't it? Why is always the question, especially if you have a 3-year-old. Why is always the question, isn't it? Why? And even as adults, we're always asking why. Why did this happen to me? Why am I in this circumstance? Why did I make that stupid choice? Why this? Why that? Why? And so it goes. And if you don't believe that God has decreed all that comes to pass, you have no answers. But if you believe that God has purposed all things that come to pass, and God is infinitely wise, so he knows what he's doing, you can have an answer to your question. When the cancer diagnosis comes, you can say, I know why. because God purposed this, because God ordained it to be the case. And I plug that in alongside of the fact that the God who purposed for me to have this is also the God that loves me with an infinite love. So you guess what? That gives me comfort. To the woman who says to the pastor of her church, why did my 2-year-old son die? I don't understand. And the pastor can say, because God purposed it for his glory and your good. It is an answer to a question. The sinner just pats you on the head and says, "Que sera, sera." Whatever will be, will be. But Reformed theology says because God has purposed all things that come to pass according to his eternal counsel for his unchangeable will, which is perfect according to his most wise, unbelievably wise understandings. What's your problem? Okay? See, this decree thing, pretty important. Really, seriously, a differentiator in theology. It sets apart a biblical, Pauline, Augustine, Calvin-based Reformed theology from everything else that calls itself a gospel. And we know that our God has purposed all things that come to pass, even the brutal murder of his own son, on behalf of a people. You cannot understand the death of Christ unless you understand the sovereignty of God. It makes no sense. But with the decree, it makes sense. God purposed it. God purposed for the first man to sin. God purposed for every man after that to sin. God purposed for his son to come into the world. God purposed for his son to be murdered by sinful men. God purposed the son to rise from the dead. He purposed the Spirit to come and resurrect a people, and every single thing in every one of their lives he has purposed. There is purpose. It has purpose. It has meaning. It has a meaning. Why? Why did God choose this? I don't know. Don't ask me. But here's what I do know. God chose it. God purposed it. God ordained it. He set it aside. And that is like a giant hammock that you fall into, and it catches you. God has decreed all that comes to pass. Everything. Everything. Every insect that eats another insect, God purposed it. We could go on like that for a couple of hours. I could just, throw out example after example. The auto accident that occurred out here and the person got injured, God purposed that, okay? And our problem, of course, as human beings is that we're always, as fallen men, we have a tendency to want God to explain himself, okay? But what we need to understand about the decree is that the decree of God is what I think to be one of the secret things of God. Deuteronomy 29:29, right? I think it's one of those things that God has purposed, all things that come to pass, most of which, the vast majority of which, we will never really be told why. Now, God has given us the reasons why for some things. I mean, we know that the murder of his son was for the redemption of a people, right? So we have a why for that. God has told us that. And there are many other things that God has told us in his word to explain why he has ordained for this or that to come to pass. And our obligation then is to go and look in the scriptures and to find the answers to our whys in this. But in the end, ultimately, our faith rests upon a God who has sovereignly ordained all that comes to pass. Because is it not true that all of his promises are based on his decree? He has purposed what he has purposed to come to pass. So God has decreed all that comes to pass. He has decreed all that is. And this is the essence of a theology that slips out of the bounds of men and moves into the nature of God and elevates God to the highest place in our minds and in our hearts. where he is the true object of our worship rather than ourselves. Our natural tendency as fallen men is to worship ourselves and to assume that we are the arbiters of our destinies. But the scriptures make it clear that our God has established all things that come to pass, and therefore he is at the center of everything because he has purposed all that comes to pass. Now, this may raise a few questions. Okay, God has ordained all that comes to pass. What about sin? And this is usually the response that you get, almost the immediate response that you get to the issue of the decree. You say, God has ordained all things. Really? So God has ordained sin too? Let us read on, shall we? Next line. Yet so as thereby, even though all that is true, the following is also true, yet so as thereby is God neither the author of sin, nor hath fellowship with any therein. So the confession writers immediately address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is, wait a minute, wait. You're saying that God ordained everything? We say, absolutely. So you're saying God has ordained sin? And we say, absolutely. Well, then aren't you saying that God sins then? Wait a minute. Time out. The decree of God is such that God has ordained all that comes to pass, but he himself is not the author of sin. He himself is not the one who creates it. What does an author do? An author writes a book. It is the author who comes up with the ideas in the book, and he puts them on paper, and he creates the book. The author generates the effects of the book. God is not the author of sin. The passage that's quoted there is from James 1:13 and 1 John 1:5, both of which we looked at not too long ago in this very church, right? Okay, so God is the one who has ordained all that comes to pass. God did purpose for Adam to fall in sin. He ordained that Eve should eat from the tree and give some to her husband should eat thereof. He ordained for the serpent to fall into sin. He ordained for all of that came to place. But he was not the one who made them sin. He did not create the sin. He did not make them sin. Sin came into the world according to God's purposes, but not because he made sin happen. Sin is against his nature. Sin is against the nature of a holy God. So it is possible for God to ordain that sin should be real in the world, and yet at the same time not be guilty of having created it. It is possible for God, in his sovereignty, in his infiniteness, to ordain that, yes, sin should enter into a world, and with it death should come. But I, God, am not the one who made that. Sin comes about by the creatures that God created who sinned, even though he purposed for them to do so and ordained that they would, but he's not forcing them to sin. Another way to say it is Adam was not a puppet. He did what he did because he willed to do so as creature created by God. Now, Adam was in a unique condition. It's always important to remember that. I think we forget that. Adam was in a unique position. He did not have a sin nature like we do. So he does not have a propensity to sin. He had a more neutral nature than we do. We can't explain exactly what it looked like because there's nothing left of it anymore for us to observe. But we do know that he had a choice that we, as fallen humans, do not. God had purpose for Adam to sin, and God had given Adam the choice, and Adam had such a choice. God had purpose for him to sin because he had ordained it, but at the same time, it was Adam who was responsible for the sin. The Bible never lays sin at the feet of God, ever. It never puts God as the one being responsible for sin. The human being involved in the sin is always the one that's held responsible. So this line is designed to say, listen, God ordains, yes, and there is evil in the world. God ordained for evil to be, he ordained for sin to be, but he himself is not the one to have made that come about. It happens according to its own will. To say it in anthropomorphic terms, all right? So God is neither the author of sin nor hath fellowship with any therein. And that's another way of saying that there is no sin in the nature of God himself, such that when he ordains for sin, it flows out of his nature into the creation. Beauty flows out of his nature into the creation. Goodness flows, righteousness flows, but evil does not flow out of his nature. So he is not in fellowship therein. It's not, he has none of it coming out of him. So he doesn't have a foil next to him that has evil in it, and he says, well, I'm going to take some of that and put it in the world. That's not how it works. That's not how the decree works. The decree insists that sin is something that God ordains but does not make happen. Again, that's beyond our comprehension to grasp. But we cannot lay at the feet of God, even in his decree, sin. The sin still falls upon the man. Okay? Does that make sense? I realize that, again, it's a difficult concept to grasp, but the confession writers want to make it clear that they are not in any way suggesting that the decree of God has something to do with God forming sin in the world. God formed a world in which sin is a possibility. He ordained for sin to come, and it came. Again, all that's anthropomorphic, but hopefully you get the point. All right, so God is... Okay, so you're saying that God has decreed all things. Okay, I'll grant you that, therefore, okay, God's not the author of sin. But are you suggesting then that because God has purposed all things to come to pass, that, well, we're just puppets on a string and we're just doing everything that God has caused us to do? And the answer to that is on the next line. Nor is violence offered to the will of the creature. Let me just pause there. Nor is violence offered to the will of the creature. That's a 17th century way of saying God does not force the will of the man. He doesn't do violence to the will, meaning he doesn't force the will of a man to act as he wills, as God wills. In other words, God's not holding you by the neck and making you do certain things. Now, there are many who would argue that, well, if God has decreed all things to come to pass and all things come to pass, then obviously God must be making us do things. No, the confession is saying, although God has ordained all that comes to pass, he has given to his creatures a will to act. He has granted to them in his sovereignty a will for them to act. Now, notice I didn't say free will, okay? Because no will is in fact free. All will is bound to the nature of the creature from which it comes. Even God's will is bound to his nature. What you choose to do flows out of who you are. So God does no violence to the will of a creature. He gives to us the freedom to make choices. Cleveland made a choice of this particular shirt. And it was a free choice on his part. Now, Cleveland happens to like blue. He happens to like this particular shirt, the short sleeves and the little thing on the thing. He likes that. And so his nature of liking that caused him to choose that particular shirt. But nonetheless, God didn't stand there with a gun to Cleveland and said, pick the blue one, because that's what I've ordained. No. Cleveland had a choice, a real choice in the matter. God had purpose for him to pick the blue one, and he did, because God's purposes always come to pass. His ordination always takes place. But God doesn't violate the will of the man to accomplish his ordination, which is another reason why this whole discussion of the decree is so hard for us to get our minds around. Because in our minds, it's either one or the other. Either God ordains nothing and everything happens because we choose it, or everything happens because God forces us to do it. But there's a middle ground, and the middle ground between those two things is something which we call compatibility. I wish I could get more people to understand this concept. There is a compatibility between the sovereign will of God on one hand and the free, in quotation marks, will of man on the other. It isn't God makes everything happen the way he wants it because he treats us like puppets. And it's not God just stands back and watches and goes, ooh, blue. Interesting. I hadn't seen that coming. Okay, that's the two ends of the spectrum that we have a tendency to fall into because we're humans. But God is in that middle ground between the two where God says, no, my will and the will of the creature are compatible with one another. The sovereign God says, I am capable, now catch this now, I am capable of ordaining everything that comes to pass. Everything happens exactly the way I want it to happen, and yet the creatures make choices. And I've given them the freedom to do so. Ho ho. Now, you will notice that that version of God is much bigger, much more profound than the God who acts like a puppet master, or the God who just turns everybody loose to do whatever they want to. The God in the center here can ordain all that comes to pass on one, and yet at the same time, let you, as a creature, act. In other words, I'll put it like this. Reformed theology starts with a view of God that's bigger, bigger, bigger than anything that you can imagine. It starts with a view of God as sovereign. Our God isn't limited by your choices. Our God ordains your choices and then turns you loose to make those choices, and you do. He foreknows them, but at the same time, his foreknowledge isn't passive. Okay, remember? God's knowledge isn't passive. His foreknowledge of them is because he has ordained them to come to pass. This was a free choice on Cleveland's part. God ordained it in advance. So God's will and Cleveland's will stand compatible with one another. That is a mighty version of God, don't you think? Much bigger version of God than what we see. Okay, so he does no violence to the will of the creature, nor, now this is a difficult sentence, but follow me, nor yet is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. Ooh, what? Okay, let's start with the key words in there, second causes. God has ordained not only what will come to pass, but how it will come to pass. Our God has decided not only what will happen, but how it will come to pass. Everything that happens, both the ends and the means, okay? God says, okay, I'm going to get from Adam in the garden to Cleveland choosing that blue shirt. And I'm going to determine everything that happens to get to that place. Okay, now can you imagine everything that went into getting to that place? I mean, do we have to we could make a list, right, of all things. Okay, your mother and your father had to have you as a child, right? Okay, that's okay. We can go back from there. Their parents had to, okay? And then their parents had to be parents of your grandparents and so on back. And then the person that made the shirt had to grow the cotton and get the blue dye and all that, and it goes back. I mean, can you imagine the number of decisions that went into that? And yet that's the point. God has ordained not only what comes out in the end, but everything that gets to it all the way along the spectrum. We call that secondary means, or in this case, second causes. Things that are not caused directly by God himself. Look, God could have come down, grabbed a cotton plant, dyed it, sowed it, given it to you. That would have been a primary cause. God spoke, and there it was, right? That's a primary cause. But everything that went into making happen what is necessary for Cleveland Shirt is a secondary cause. It's not directly from God. It's the billions upon billions of decisions of human beings from the days of Adam to the days of Cleveland that have made that a possibility. So not only has God not offered violence to the will of the creature, and he has not taken away the liberty or contingency of second causes. He has allowed for second causes to have their actions. And in other words, every decision that is made by human beings and animals and insects and birds, every single decision that's made by all of those creatures over time, every single one of them has consequences, right? There are consequences to every single decision. Every time you choose something, it has an effect. You chose the shirt, guess what? You're wearing it. And your pastor is using you as an illustration, okay? That is contingency. There are many, many things that are contingent upon the decisions. There are an virtually infinite number of contingencies that have taken place in human history from the days that God took dust from the ground and formed Adam. There have been an unknown number of them, but God has not taken away those contingencies, but rather he has included them in his decree. They are part of his purpose. They're part of the plan. They're part of the decree itself. Every little detail that gets you all the way from point A to point B in terms of what God is trying to get done, God has purposed every single bit of it. He has not removed the liberty or contingency of second causes, but rather establishes them, meaning his decree establishes that he intended for second causes. God is not the one who hung Jesus on the cross. Roman soldiers did that. But the reason why the Roman soldiers did that is because Pilate told them to do that. And the reason why Pilate told them to do that is because he was afraid of the Jewish leadership at the temple. And the reason they were afraid is because Jesus had said he was going to tear down the temple. And so it goes. But all of those secondary causes led to the end that God had purposed, and he purposed every single step along the way, along with several hundred other million decisions that needed to be made from the days of Jesus' birth to the days of Jesus' death. As just a small fraction. I mean, think about it. Somebody had to figure out the idea of crucifixion. Somebody had to come up with that idea. Because, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but crucifixion as a form of execution was very short-lived. It took only a short period of time in human history, and it disappeared. The Romans realized it was very ineffective after a while. Somebody had to figure that out. Who did? God did. He purposed it. Every little thing all the way to accomplish the purpose of God is a part of his decree. All right, we'll finish that last sentence in that paragraph when we come back next week, Lord willing. But I hope you're beginning to get a taste of this thing called the decree, because this is some serious theological stuff here. This is again, what separates the men from the boys. But let me also suggest to you this not only does that, but it really sets a foundation under all of the rest of what we believe and why. You will hear Reformed people talk often about the fact that the sovereignty of God is at the center of Reformed theology. They're absolutely right. That sovereignty is his decree, his purpose in all things.